He had kept them away from all of it. The streets, the danger, the cost of who he was. Then the phone rang, and the world he built to protect them cracked. Chapter 1. The Call. The house was quiet the way Bumpy liked it. Not empty quiet, not lonely quiet. The kind of quiet that meant everyone was home, everyone was safe, and the world outside had, for one more night, kept its distance. Mamie was in the kitchen. He could hear the low sound of the radio, something soft, something she always kept at a volume just below conversation. His daughter had gone to bed an hour ago. The lamp in the sitting room threw a warm circle of light across the floor, and Bumpy Johnson sat inside that circle with a book open on his knee and a glass of bourbon he hadn't touched in 40 minutes. He was not a man who relaxed easily, but this was as close as he got. There are men in this world who leave their work at the door, who hang up their coat, sit at the table, and become something else entirely once the lock turns. Bumpy Johnson was not one of those men. He knew that. Mamie knew that. Even his daughter, young as she was, had learned to read the weight he carried in, not in what he said, but in how long it took him to sit down. But tonight, the weight was manageable. Tonight, Harlem felt like something he had in his hands. Then the phone rang. He didn't move immediately. That was the thing people never understood about Bumpy Johnson. Reaction was not his language. Response was. And there is a world of difference between the two. Reaction belongs to frightened men. Response belongs to men who have already considered every possibility before the moment arrives. He looked at the phone the way a chess player looks at a move he didn't expect, not alarmed but interested, calculating. He picked up on the third ring. Yeah. One word. Flat. No warmth, no invitation. The voice on the other end was male. Oh, young. Younger than it should have been for someone making this particular call. And it was trying very hard to sound like it wasn't afraid. Bumpy could hear the effort in it. The way the words came out just slightly too quick, like the man had rehearsed them and was now burning through the rehearsal before his nerve ran out. The voice said a name, his daughter's name. Bumpy did not speak. He let the silence sit there between them like a third person in the room. Because silence, used correctly, is not emptiness. It is pressure. It is the sound of a man who is not rattled, not confused, not searching for words, but simply deciding. And the decision, when it came, would not be announced. It would simply arrive. The voice on the other end filled the silence the wrong way. It kept talking. It gave details it didn't need to give. It made a demand that revealed in its very specificity that whoever was behind this did not truly understand who they were calling. And if they had understood, they never would have called. Bumpy set the receiver down, not slammed, set, gently. The way you set down something fragile that you intend to deal with properly, later when the time is right. He sat still for a moment. The radio was still playing in the kitchen. Mamie's voice hummed something low, a half melody, just under the music. Down the hall, the house breathed slowly around its sleeping child. None of that had changed. Man, the room was the same room it had been 60 seconds ago. The lamp threw the same circle of light. The bourbon sat untouched. The book lay open on his knee. But Bumpy Johnson was no longer reading it. He stood, straightened his jacket, not out of vanity, out of habit. The habit of a man who understood that how you carry yourself in a private moment is exactly how you'll carry yourself when it counts. He walked to the window and looked out at Harlem. The avenue below was alive with its usual night. Voices, laughter, the low roll of a passing car, children of the street still moving through their hours, the way they always had, the way they always would. He had given a great deal to this neighborhood, and this neighborhood had given a great deal back. But what it had never been permitted to give him, what he had refused at great cost for many years, was access to his family. That line had always been clear. But it had been clear to the Italians, clear to the law, clear to every man who had ever sat across a table from Ellsworth Johnson and negotiated the terms of their survival. That line was not a threat. It was not a rule he enforced with violence. It was simply the one thing he never had to explain twice, until tonight. He went back to his chair, sat down. picked up his bourbon for the first time all evening, and took a slow, measured sip. He was not angry. Anger was for men who hadn't seen this coming. Bumpy Johnson had seen everything coming sooner or later. That was the burden of being the kind of man he was. You could not be surprised by the world when you had spent your entire life learning every dark room of it. What he felt was something quieter than anger, something colder. It was the feeling a man gets when he realizes that a lesson he thought was already taught is going to have to be taught again. And this time, there would be no ambiguity about it. Down the hall, his daughter slept. The radio played softly in the kitchen, and Bumpy Johnson sat in his circle of lamplight, perfectly still, already 3 moves ahead. Chapter 2. The Wall Between Two Worlds. There is a version of Ellsworth Johnson that Harlem knew, and there is a version that only his family knew. Most men who live double lives do so out of weakness, out of deception, out of the inability to reconcile what they want with what the world demands of them. They build walls because they are ashamed, because they are hiding, because some part of them believes that if the two worlds ever touched, one of them would destroy the other. Bumpy Johnson built his wall for a different reason entirely. He built it out of love. He had grown up understanding, early, knowing the way children in certain neighborhoods always understand things early, that the world did not distribute its dangers evenly, that some people were born into calm and some people were born into the storm, and the difference between the two had very little to do with character and almost everything to do with geography, with the color of your skin, with the block you came home to at night. He had been born into the storm. He had not chosen it. But somewhere along the way, in the reformatories, in the streets, in the years of watching men who commanded rooms without raising their voices, he had decided something. Not that he would escape the storm. That was never an option made available to him. But that he would learn to move through it in a way that gave him something to protect. Something worth protecting. Mamie was that first. Then his daughter. And from the moment those people entered his life, Bumpy Johnson began the quiet, disciplined, exhausting work of keeping the storm away from the door. It was not dramatic work. That is what people misunderstood about men like him. They imagined the protection of family as something cinematic. Guards at the door, whispered warnings, dramatic confrontations in dimly lit rooms. And yes, sometimes it was those things. But mostly it was smaller than that. Mostly it was a series of daily decisions, invisible to everyone but him, that cumulatively built something resembling safety. It was the choice to never bring certain men to the house. It was the choice to conduct business in specific places and never others. It was the deliberate cultivation of a reputation so clear, so consistent, so universally understood across Harlem and beyond, that the mere mention of his name near his family's address would be enough, would always be enough, to make any reasonable man reconsider. Reputation, built correctly, is the most durable form of protection there is. It does not sleep. It does not need to be stationed at a corner. It travels ahead of you into every room, every conversation, every phone call, made by men who are thinking about doing something they shouldn't. Bumpy had spent decades building that reputation. Not through cruelty, not through randomness, through consistency, through being at all times and in all circumstances exactly who he said he was, a man of his word, a man of his neighborhood, a man who could be reasoned with, right up until the moment he couldn't. But there was a cost to the wall. There is always a cost. The same discipline that kept the street away from his front door also kept him, the full version of him, away from the people inside it. Because you cannot be 2 men in one room. You can be the king of Harlem at night and a husband in the morning. But there are hours in between where neither version of you knows what to do with its hands. Mamie felt it. She never said so directly, that was not her way. But Bumpy could see it in the patience she carried, the particular patience of a woman who loves a man she has never fully been allowed to know. She knew enough. She had chosen him knowing enough. But there were rooms inside him she had learned not to knock on. Not because he had told her not to, but because a woman as intelligent as Mamie Johnson could read a closed door without being told what was behind it. His daughter was different. His daughter looked at him the way children look at fathers when they are still young enough to believe their fathers are the largest, safest, most permanent things in the world. She did not see the wall. She only saw the man on the other side of it. The man who read to her. The man who brought her things from the street. Not dangerous things, and small things, beautiful things. The kind of thing a man picks up when he's walking through the world and suddenly thinks, she would like this. That version of Bumpy Johnson, the one who thought of her when he was walking through the world, was the version the wall was built to preserve. Harlem, for its part, had always respected the arrangement, not out of sentiment. Harlem was not a sentimental place. It respected the arrangement, because Bumpy Johnson had earned that respect. Transaction by transaction, year by year, crisis by crisis. He had fed people during hard winters. He had settled disputes that would have otherwise drawn blood. He had stood between his community and forces, police, organized crime, the indifferent machinery of a city that was never quite built with Harlem in mind, that would have ground ordinary men down to nothing. He had never asked for gratitude. He had asked only for understanding. This is who I am. This is what I do. And these people, this woman, this child, they are not part of it. They are the reason for it. That understanding had held through the years, through the rivalries, through the long stretches in federal custody, where the wall had to be maintained from a distance, through letters, through the particular ache of a man who cannot protect what he loves because the law has put iron bars between him and it. It had held. Until last night. Bumpy stood in the kitchen the morning after the call. Mamie was at the stove. She had not asked about the phone. She had been awake. He knew she had been awake. She was always awake when something moved through the house at that hour. But she had waited. She had let the morning come first, the way she always did, understanding that some conversations need daylight before they can be had honestly. He watched her from the doorway for a moment. The radio was on again. Same low volume. The kitchen smelled like coffee and something warm in the oven. His daughter's school bag sat by the door, packed and ready, the way it always was, because Mamie Johnson did not raise a child who left the house unprepared. Everything is fine, that kitchen said. Nothing has changed. The wall is still standing. Bumpy knew better. The wall was still standing. But someone had put their hands on it, had tested it, deliberately, with full knowledge of what it was and who had built it. And that act, not the threat itself, but the choice to make it, told Bumpy everything he needed to know about the person on the other end of that phone. This was not an enemy who understood the rules. This was an enemy who had decided the rules did not apply to them. And that, in Bumpy Johnson's world, was the most dangerous kind. Not because they were strong, because they were ignorant. And ignorant men, cornered or emboldened, were capable of things that rational men simply were not. He poured his coffee. Aiden sat at the table, listened to the radio. Mamie set a plate in front of him without a word. He looked up at her. She looked back. In that exchange, in 2 seconds, no words, 30 years of a shared life compressed into a glance, everything necessary was communicated. She knew. He knew she knew. And she knew from the way he sat, from the way he had already settled into that particular stillness of his, that whatever needed to happen next was already in motion. She sat down across from him. No, they had breakfast. Down the hall, their daughter was getting ready for school. The wall was still standing. But Bumpy Johnson had already begun deciding what to do about the man who had touched it. Chapter 3. Someone who doesn't know the rules. His name was not important. That was the first thing Bumpy established when the information came back to him. And information always came back to him. That was the nature of what he had built in Harlem. A network not of spies or soldiers, but of people, ordinary people, who lived their lives on these streets and who understood without being told that keeping Bumpy Johnson informed was simply part of how the neighborhood kept itself healthy. The name came through by noon. A young man, 26, maybe 27, had come up through one of the newer operations running out of the lower blocks, the kind of operation that had sprouted in the gaps. And there were always gaps, in any city, in any era, between the established order and the hunger of the next generation. He had moved quickly, had shown a talent for pressure, for intimidation, for the kind of short-term thinking that looks like boldness when you are young and inexperienced, and have not yet learned the difference between a move that wins the moment and a move that costs you everything 3 months later. He had money, not a lot, enough to make him feel larger than he was. He had men around him, not many, enough to make him feel protected, and he had somewhere along the way developed the particular delusion that afflicts a certain kind of young man in a certain kind of world. The delusion that the rules everyone else lives by are, in fact, optional, that they are suggestions made by men who lacked the nerve to simply take what they wanted. That restraint is weakness, dressed up as principle. Bumpy had known men like this his entire life. He had outlived every single one of them. The thing about Harlem, the thing that outsiders never fully grasped, the thing that even some of its own residents underestimated, was that it had a memory, not an institutional memory, not the kind kept in files or documented in ledgers, a human memory, the kind that lives in the woman at the beauty shop who has been on the same block for 40 years, in the man who runs the numbers out of the back of a dry goods store and who has watched 3 generations of the same family grow up on his corner, in the deacon at the church on 133rd, who knows the name of every mother who has ever wept in his pew and the reason she was weeping. These people remembered everything. They remembered who had helped and who had taken, who had kept their word and who had broken it, who had protected the neighborhood from the worst of what the world could send, and who had simply used the neighborhood as a place to conduct business without obligation or consequence. Bumpy Johnson in their memory was the former. He had never been a saint. He would have laughed at the suggestion. But he had been, consistently, deliberately, over decades, a man who understood that power in a community is borrowed, that you hold it on behalf of the people around you, and the moment you forget that, nor the moment you begin to treat it as something you own rather than something you are trusted with, it begins to dissolve. That understanding was the foundation of everything he had built. The young man who had made that phone call understood none of this. Bumpy learned the full shape of it by mid-afternoon. The call had not been random. That was important. Random threats are made by frightened men lashing out without direction, and frightened men are manageable. This had been deliberate, calculated in the limited way that a young man with more nerve than wisdom calculates things. It had been a message, not just to Bumpy, but to the street, a declaration visible to anyone paying attention, that this young man was not afraid of Ellsworth Johnson, that he would reach places other men had the sense to leave untouched. He had wanted people to know he had made that call. He had told people he had made that call. That was the detail that told Bumpy everything. Because there are 2 kinds of dangerous men in this world. The first kind is dangerous because of what they are willing to do. They have weight. They have history. When they make a move, it comes from a deep and considered place, and the consequences radiate outward in ways that are felt for years. These men are rare, and they are, in a strange way, manageable, because they operate according to logic, and logic can always be met with logic. The second kind is dangerous because of what they are willing to say, because they have confused noise with power, because they have watched enough men command rooms that they believe the commanding is in the volume, in the gesture, in the public display, and not in the decades of quiet work that gave those men the right to stand in those rooms in the first place. The young man who had called Bumpy Johnson's house was the second kind. And the second kind, the loud kind. The performative kind, the kind that needed an audience for every move it made, was in many ways more immediately dangerous than the first. Not because of their strength, but because of their unpredictability. Because a man performing for an audience will escalate, not based on strategy, but based on the crowd's reaction. He will do more than he intended. He will go further than is wise. He will back himself into corners that a smarter man would have never entered. And then, because the audience is still watching, he will feel compelled to do something drastic, simply to avoid the appearance of having backed down. Bumpy had seen that pattern play out more times than he could count. It always ended the same way. He sat in the back of a car on Lenox Avenue as the afternoon light began to flatten and go gold across the rooftops of Harlem. One of his men, a quiet man, reliable, the kind who understood that his value was in his discretion and not his volume, sat in the front without speaking. He knew better than to speak when Bumpy was thinking. Everyone who had spent more than a month in proximity to Bumpy Johnson knew that his silences were not invitations for conversation. They were working silences. The kind a craftsman has when he's measuring something twice before he cuts it once. Outside the window, the neighborhood moved through its afternoon. A group of older men played cards on a stoop, their voices carrying that particular rhythm of men who have been laughing at the same jokes for 30 years and find them no less funny for the repetition. A woman walked by with groceries, two children orbiting her like small planets, pulling in opposite directions. A teenager leaned against a wall with the studied nonchalance of someone who was trying very hard to look like he wasn't watching anything, and watching everything. Harlem. On his neighborhood. His responsibility. The place that had made him and unmade him and made him again several times over, with the particular patience of a community that understood that the men it produced were complicated, that goodness and danger could live in the same body, that a man could be feared on Monday and needed on Tuesday and mourned on a Wednesday that nobody wanted to think about yet. He loved it without sentimentality. The way you love something you have bled for. The young man's name was spoken once more by the quiet man in the front seat. Not as a question, not as a prompt. Simply as a confirmation that the information was accurate and complete. Bumpy said nothing. He watched a child on the sidewalk chase a ball into the gutter, scoop it up, run back to the stoop where his mother was sitting. The mother looked up from whatever she was reading just long enough to see that he was safe, then looked back down. That was it. That small moment. And that was what the phone call had threatened. Not Bumpy Johnson's power, not his business, not his reputation on the street, which was durable enough to survive provocations far greater than this one. It had threatened that. The ordinary safety of ordinary people, going about ordinary lives in a neighborhood that had precious little protection from a world that did not particularly care about its survival. And that, far more than any personal affront, was what had settled something cold and final in Bumpy Johnson's chest, somewhere between last night and this afternoon. This would be resolved, not loudly, not publicly, not in a way that would feed the young man's need for an audience or confirm to anyone watching that his gesture had produced the reaction he was performing for. It would be resolved the way Bumpy Johnson resolved most things, quietly, completely, and with the kind of finality that didn't require a crowd. He tapped the door of the car twice, the signal to move. The quiet man pulled out into traffic without a word. They drove north through Harlem as the evening came down over the avenue, slow and inevitable, the way everything inevitable comes. Not all at once, but by degrees, until suddenly the light is gone and you're in a different world than the one you woke up in. Bumpy Johnson looked out the window. Somewhere across this city, a young man was still telling people what he had done, still performing, still believing that the silence on the other end of that phone call had been fear. He had mistaken patience for weakness. It was the last mistake of that particular kind he would ever make. Chapter 4. The father in the room. He came home before dinner. That was unusual enough that Mamie noticed it without commenting on it. She registered it the way she registered most things about Bumpy. Not with words, but with a slight adjustment in her posture, a recalibration of the room's atmosphere, the quiet acknowledgement of a woman who had learned over many years to read her husband the way a sailor reads weather. Not by looking directly at the sky, but by feeling the pressure change. He hung his coat by the door, washed his hands at the kitchen sink, stood at the window for a moment with a dish towel in his hands, looking out at the back of the building across the alley, yard where someone had strung a line of laundry that moved slowly in the early evening air. Then he sat down at the kitchen table and waited for his daughter to come home from school. She arrived 20 minutes later. The door opened with that particular burst of energy that only children carry, the full-body announcement of arrival. The bag dropped without ceremony, the shoes that never quite made it all the way to where they were supposed to go. She came into the kitchen already talking, not the way she always did, the way that never failed to do something to Bumpy's chest that he had no adequate language for. A warmth, a loosening, something that the street had no equivalent of and no use for. She stopped when she saw him, not out of fear, out of surprise. "You're home." Not a question, an observation. The slightly accusatory observation of a child who has established, through long experience, a reliable set of expectations about when her father would and would not be present, and who treats any deviation from that pattern as a minor personal affront. Bumpy looked at her over the rim of his coffee cup. "I live here," he said. She considered this for a moment with the particular gravity that children apply to statements they are deciding whether or not to accept as sufficient. Then, she pulled out the chair across from him. His chair, the one nobody sat in when he was home. A fact she knew perfectly well and was exploiting with full awareness, and sat down. Mamie, Monette the stove, did not turn around, but Bumpy could see from the set of her shoulders that she was smiling. They sat together for a while. His daughter talked. She had a great deal to say about her day, about a teacher who had been unfair, about a girl at school who had said something worth analyzing in considerable depth, about a book she was reading that she had opinions about and wanted to share whether or not those opinions were solicited. She talked the way rivers move, continuous, self-directed, finding its own level, filling whatever space was available. Bumpy listened, not the way a distracted man listens, nodding at intervals, registering tone without content, waiting for the pause that signals his turn to speak. He listened the way he did everything, completely, with his full attention turned toward her like a lamp, so that she was illuminated by it, so that she could feel, without being told, that there was nowhere else in the world he would rather be than in this kitchen, at this table, hearing about a teacher who had been unfair and a girl who had said something worth considerable analysis. This was not performance. This was the other thing, the real thing, the thing the wall existed to protect. Later, after dinner, after his daughter had retreated to her room with the book she had opinions about, Bumpy remained at the table. Mamie cleared the dishes with the efficient and unhurried movements of a woman who has performed this particular act of domestic grace so many times that it has become a kind of meditation. She did not rush. She did not linger. She moved around the kitchen the way water moves around stone, finding the path of least resistance, getting where she needed to go, making it look effortless in a way that concealed an enormous amount of quiet skill. When the dishes were done, she dried her hands, sat across from him, put her hands flat on the table between them, not reaching for his, not demanding anything, simply placing herself in the conversation in a way that said, "I am here. I am not going anywhere. And I am not afraid of whatever you are about to not tell me." Bumpy looked at her hands on the table. Then he looked at her face. There are conversations that happen in words, and there are conversations that happen in the space between two people who have known each other long enough that language is, at best, a rough approximation of what is actually being communicated. This was the second kind. He did not tell her about the phone call in detail. He did not need to. She had heard the phone ring. She had felt the house change in the hours after. She had watched him come home early for the first time in months and sit at the kitchen table and listen to their daughter with that particular quality of attention that men only give to things they are afraid of losing. She already knew the shape of it, what she was asking, with her hands flat on the table, with her eyes steady on his face, with the patience of a woman who had waded through federal prison sentences and street wars and decades of a life that most women would not have chosen, and that she had chosen anyway, fully, without apology. What she was asking was simpler than any of the details. "Are we all right?" Bumpy held her gaze for a long moment. He thought about the young man across the city who was still performing for his audience. He thought about the quiet man in the front seat of the car who had spoken a name and then said nothing else. He thought about the decades of work, the careful architecture of separation, The wall built brick by brick out of discipline and love, and the particular sacrifices that men like him make in the dark, where nobody sees them and nobody thanks them, and the only measure of success is what doesn't happen. He put his hand over hers. "We're all right," he said. 2 words. And the thing about Bumpy Johnson, the thing that Mamie Johnson understood better than anyone alive, was that he did not say things he did not mean. That was not sentimentality. Hey, that was not the reassurance of a man trying to manage his wife's emotions. He was not a man who managed people. He was a man who dealt in truth, even when truth was uncomfortable, because he had learned early and learned hard that the short-term comfort of a convenient lie always extracted a longer-term price that wasn't worth paying. If he said we're all right, it was because he had already decided that they would be. Not hoped, not intended, decided. And in Bumpy Johnson's world, so the distance between a decision and its execution was simply a matter of time. Mamie looked at him for another moment. Then, she nodded once. Slow. The nod of a woman who is not naive, who is not being pacified, but who has chosen, deliberately, with full knowledge of what that choice costs, to trust the man sitting across from her. She stood, squeezed his hand once before she let it go, went to the bedroom, and left him at the table with the lamp burning low and the radio playing its soft, late-night frequency and the sound of the city outside moving through its hours. Down the hall, his daughter read her book. On the page she was probably on, something was happening to some character that she would have opinions about tomorrow. She would share them whether or not those opinions were solicited. She would sit in his chair because she knew it was his chair. She would look at him with the uncomplicated certainty of a child who believes her father is the largest, safest, most permanent thing in the world. Bumpy sat with that. Let it settle over him like something he was trying to memorize. Because here's the thing about men who live the way Bumpy Johnson lived. They do not get to be certain, not about the future, not about what waits for them on the other side of the decisions they make, and the enemies they accumulate, and the wars they win, and the ones they survive without quite winning. They do not get to make promises about tomorrow with the confidence of men whose tomorrows are uncomplicated. What they get, if they are lucky, if they have built something worth protecting, if the wall has held through all the years it was asked to hold, is this: a kitchen that smells like dinner, a child reading a book down the hall, a woman who squeezes your hand and trusts you. One evening, ordinary and irreplaceable, and already becoming the past even as you sit inside it, trying to hold it still. Bumpy finished his coffee, set the cup down, straightened his jacket, out of habit, not vanity. Stood. There was something that needed to be handled. He had given his family tonight. Tomorrow belonged to something else entirely. Chapter 5. Calm is the weapon. He did not send anyone ahead of him. That was the first decision. And like most of Bumpy Johnson's decisions, it communicated something before a single word had been spoken. In the world he operated in, the architecture of a meeting told you everything about the man who called it. You sent soldiers ahead when you were afraid and needed the fear distributed around the room before you entered it. You sent a message through intermediaries when you lacked the confidence to deliver it yourself. You arrived with an entourage when you needed other men's presence to complete your own. Bumpy arrived alone. One car, one driver who stayed outside. One man walking through a door in Harlem on a Thursday evening as though he had simply decided, on a quiet night, to take a walk and end up here. The room was a back room. Not dramatic. These things never were in reality. A table, several chairs, a single bulb overhead throwing flat light across everything. 2 of the young man's people stood against the far wall with the posture of men who were trying to project menace and were achieving, at best, discomfort. The young man himself sat at the table. He had clearly expected something different. He had expected soldiers. He had expected the formal machinery of consequence. The retinue, the hardened faces, the visible weight of an organization mobilized and present. Then he had prepared himself, psychologically, for confrontation at scale. He had his audience in mind. He had, in all likelihood, already begun composing the story he would tell afterward. Instead, he got one man in a good coat, moving without urgency, pulling out a chair across the table with the unhurried ease of someone sitting down to a business meeting he had attended 100 times before and found moderately interesting at best. Bumpy sat, folded his hands on the table, looked at the young man. He did not speak immediately. 30 seconds passed. In a room charged with the particular electricity of anticipated confrontation, 30 seconds of silence from the man everyone is watching is an extraordinary amount of time. It is long enough for the room to recalibrate, long enough for the men against the wall to shift their weight without meaning to, long enough for the young man across the table, who had spent the last 24 hours performing confidence for anyone who would watch, to feel, for the first time, something loosen in his chest that he had very much wanted to keep tight. Bumpy let the silence do its work. He was in no hurry. He had never been in a hurry in his life. Hurry was for men who were afraid the moment would pass before they could seize it. Bumpy Johnson had built a world where the moments came to him. So when he finally spoke, his voice was low, not a whisper. That would have been theater, just low. The natural register of a man who has never needed volume to be heard. You know who I am. Not a question. The young man held his gaze. To his credit, and Bumpy noted this, filed it away with the same dispassion with which he filed everything, the young man did not look away immediately. He had nerve. That had never been in dispute. Nerve was, in fact, the least interesting thing about him. Dang, the street was full of nerve. Nerve was cheap and abundant, and it got men killed with remarkable regularity because they confused it with the thing it was not, which was wisdom. I know who you are, the young man said. His voice had the careful flatness of someone reciting a line they have practiced. There was tension underneath it, the way there is tension in a cable pulled too tight. Not visible, but audible, if you knew what to listen for. Bumpy knew what to listen for. Then you know, Bumpy said, that I don't come to rooms like this unless the matter is serious. A pause. And you know that I don't consider most matters serious. One of the men against the wall moved, just slightly, a shift of weight, a hand moving toward something at his side. And Bumpy turned his head and looked at him. Just looked. No words, no gesture, no change in expression. The man went still. That was the thing that the young man across the table witnessed in that moment, sound that Bumpy knew he was witnessing. And that was more instructive than anything that could have been said. Because words can be doubted. Words can be rehearsed, inflated, performed. But a man who can stop another man's movement with nothing but a look, that cannot be faked. That is not nerve. That is not performance. That is something that accumulates over decades in the marrow of a man who has been, for longer than this young man had been alive, and the most consequential person in every room he entered. Bumpy turned back to the young man as though the interruption had not occurred. I'm going to tell you something, he said, and I want you to hear it the way I mean it. Not the way fear tells you to hear it. Not the way pride tells you to hear it. He unfolded his hands, placed them flat on the table. The same gesture Mamie had made the night before, and if that symmetry occurred to him, nothing in his face showed it. You made a call, he said. To my home. You said a name that has nothing to do with anything that happens on these streets, and then you told people about it. He let that sit. That last part, he said, was the part I found interesting. The young man said nothing. A man who makes a move and keeps it quiet, Bumpy continued, is a man who's thinking about outcomes. A man who makes a move and then tells everyone he made it. That man is thinking about something else. He's thinking about how he looks. He tilted his head slightly. You want to look like something in this neighborhood. I understand that. Every young man in the city wants to look like something. There's no shame in that. A pause. Long enough to be deliberate. But you chose the wrong demonstration. The young man's jaw tightened. Bumpy saw it. He saw everything. I got people too, the young man said. The practiced flatness was fraying slightly at the edges now, the rehearsed line giving way to something more unguarded. I know what you got, Bumpy said. Quietly, without dismissal, without contempt. Simply as a statement of fact from a man who had, by noon the previous day, known exactly what this young man had, down to the number of people around him and the nature of the operation he was running and the specific geography of his ambitions. I'm not here about what you got, Bumpy said. I'm here about what you did. No, those are different conversations. He leaned forward slightly. Not aggressively, not theatrically. The way a man leans forward when he wants to make certain he's being heard clearly. What you did, he said, was reach into a place that has never been part of this. Not for any man who has ever had business in Harlem. Not for the Italians, not for the law, not for anyone who ever sat across a table from me in 30 years. He held the young man's eyes. Not because they couldn't, he said, because they understood what it would mean if they did. The room was absolutely still. The two men against the wall were no longer performing menace. They were simply standing there, recalculated, reconfigured by the atmosphere that Bumpy Johnson had built in this room, without raising his voice, without making a threat, without doing anything except sitting in a chair and speaking at a volume that required the room to be quiet in order to hear him. And that was the dominance, not the threat of what he could do, the certainty of who he was. Here is what's going to happen, Bumpy said. His voice had not changed in register or temperature since he sat down. It was the same voice. It would always be the same voice. That consistency, that absolute refusal to be emotionally moved by the mechanics of confrontation, was itself the most powerful thing in the room. You're going to go back to what you were doing before you made that call. Ma, you're going to do it quietly. You're going to do it without any further demonstrations in any direction. He stood, slowly, without drama, buttoned the middle button of his coat. And you're going to tell the people you told about that phone call, he said, that it was a mistake. He looked at the young man one final time. Not because I'm asking you to, he said, because you're going to understand between now and tomorrow morning that it was. He walked to the door, opened it, and paused with his back still half turned to the room. You have something, he said, without looking back. You have nerve, and you have hunger. And in this city, those things are worth something. Don't spend them on this. A beat. This city has room for men who know what they're doing. Another beat, smaller, quieter. It has no room for men who don't know what they've done. He walked out. The door closed behind him. The driver was where he'd left him, leaning against the car with the patience of a man who had learned, a long time ago, that waiting for Bumpy Johnson was simply part of the work. He straightened when he saw him come out, moved to open the door. Bumpy walked to the car without hurrying, got in. The door closed. The car pulled out into the Harlem night, the avenue alive with its usual motion, its usual voices, its usual layered music of a neighborhood that had survived everything the century had thrown at it and was still, and stubbornly, magnificently itself. Bumpy looked out the window as they drove. He did not feel triumphant. He never did, after these things. Triumph was for men who had been uncertain of the outcome. Bumpy Johnson had not been uncertain. He had walked into that room already knowing how it would end, not because he was arrogant, but because he had spent his entire life learning to read the shape of things before they became the thing they were. The young man would do what he had been told, not out of fear exactly, although fear was present, but more than fear. And this was the thing Bumpy had needed him to understand, the thing the entire meeting had been constructed to deliver. More than fear, the young man would do what he was told, because he had sat across a table from Ellsworth Johnson for 20 minutes and had finally, in the marrow of his bones, understood something. That the silence on the other end of that phone call had not been fear. It had never been fear, and it had been a man deciding. Chapter 6. What Legacy Costs. He was home by 9. The house was quiet again. The good quiet. The same quiet he had been sitting inside 2 nights ago when the phone rang, and the world shifted slightly on its axis in a way that only he had felt. Because he was the kind of man who felt those shifts before anyone else did, who registered the first tremor while everyone around him was still looking at a steady floor. Mamie was awake. She was always awake when he came in late, not waiting. She was not a woman who waited in the anxious, pacing sense of the word. She was simply awake, reading in the chair by the lamp in the bedroom, doing the things she would have been doing whether he was coming home or not, because Mamie Johnson had built a life that did not hold its breath for anyone, even the man she had chosen to share it with. That was one of the things he loved most about her. She looked up when he came to the doorway, as he leaned against the frame. Everything all right? She said. Everything's all right, he said. She held his gaze for a moment, that same steady, undeceivable gaze that had looked through him for 30 years and had never once found what it was looking for, which was a lie. And then she nodded, once, and went back to her book. He stood in the doorway a moment longer than necessary. Then he went to check on his daughter. She was asleep. The book was on the nightstand, face down, and splayed open at a page she had fallen asleep on, which meant she had been reading past the point her eyes could manage and had refused to admit it until the admission became involuntary. He recognized that. He had always recognized that in her. The refusal to surrender to limitation before limitation made the argument for itself. She got that from him. He stood in the doorway of her room the way he had stood in the doorway of Mame's, not entering, not needing to enter. I simply present at the threshold, watching, memorizing in the particular way of a man who has learned not to take ordinary moments for granted, because he has lived long enough to know how quickly ordinary moments become the ones you would give anything to have back. She breathed slowly in the dark. The book waited on the nightstand. The wall had held. He went to the kitchen, poured himself a small glass of bourbon. The same glass in a different way, that he had left untouched 2 nights ago when the phone rang. He sat at the table, did not turn on the radio. Let the kitchen be what it was, silent and still. The residue of dinner still faintly present in the air. The chairs pushed in at uneven angles the way chairs always are in houses where people actually live in them. He sat with his drink for a long time. This is the part that nobody tells you about. Not the confrontations, not the negotiations. Not the years of building something out of nothing in a neighborhood that the rest of the city would have been content to let consume itself. Not the prison years, not the rivals, not the long, slow work of becoming the kind of man whose name travels ahead of him into every room and does the work before he arrives. None of that is the hard part. The hard part is this. The kitchen at 9 o'clock on a Thursday night, aimed with the bourbon and the quiet and the full knowledge of everything you have done and everything it has cost and everything it will continue to cost for as long as you are the man you are. The hard part is the accounting. Bumpy Johnson had given Harlem a great deal. He had given it protection during years when protection was not being offered by anyone with the official authority to provide it. He had given it money, not in the sentimental, ceremonial way of a man purchasing goodwill, but in the practical, consistent way of a man who understood that a neighborhood is only as stable as its most vulnerable residents, and that stability required resources, and that resources required someone willing to move them in directions the legitimate economy had no interest in moving them. He had given it order, his particular brand of order, not the order of law, which had historically shown very little interest in the well-being of Harlem specifically, but the order of consequence, and the understanding that certain things would not be tolerated, that certain lines would not be crossed, that the community had in him someone who took its preservation personally, who would answer for its violations with the full weight of everything he had built. He had given it himself, and the self he had given it was the self that could not fully come home. That was the ledger. On one side, everything he had built, everything he had protected, and the decades of presence and principle, and the particular kind of love that expresses itself not in sentiment, but in sacrifice. The families who had eaten because of him, the disputes that had not become funerals because of him, the slow, invisible, uncelebrated work of keeping a neighborhood from tearing itself apart in the ways that neighborhoods without someone like him inevitably did. On the other side, the wall that kept his family safe and also kept him from them. The version of himself that Mamie had never fully been allowed to know. The father who listened completely, who brought small, beautiful things from the street, who stood in doorways memorizing ordinary moments, but who could never fully explain to his daughter what those moments cost him, or why he valued them with the specific intensity of a man who had always known, at some level below conscious thought, that they were finite. You cannot be the thing he was, and guarantee the things he wanted to guarantee. You can only work toward them, build toward them. Maintain the wall with everything you have and understand that the wall is not permanence. It is effort, daily, renewed, unacknowledged effort. And on the nights when the wall holds, when you come home and the house is quiet and your daughter is asleep with her book and your wife looks up from her reading and the question she asks is simply, everything all right? And the answer is simply, everything's all right. On those nights, the ledger balances, imperfectly, temporarily, but it balances. He thought about the young man in that back room. He thought about him not with anger. The anger, to whatever extent it had existed, had burned clean and cold and fast, the way Bumpy's anger always did, leaving behind something more durable and less volatile. He thought about him with something closer to recognition, because he had been young once, in this same city, in this same neighborhood, with the same hunger and the same nerve and the same dangerous confusion between what he wanted to be and what he actually was. The difference was that someone had taught him, not gently, not by choice. No, the lessons had come the way all serious lessons come, through consequence, through failure, through the long education of a life lived at the edges of what was survivable. But they had come. And somewhere in the accumulation of those lessons, he had become the man he was. The man who could sit in a room and not speak for 30 seconds and feel the room reshape itself around his silence. The young man in that back room had potential. Bumpy had seen it clearly, had acknowledged it, and in his own way, in the last thing he had said before walking out the door. You have something. He had meant that. He did not say things he did not mean. Whether the young man would do something worthwhile with what he had, whether tonight had been the beginning of an education or simply the first chapter of a different, shorter story, that was not something Bumpy could control. He had delivered the lesson. He had delivered it in the most powerful way available to him, which was not violence and not threat, but simple, undeniable presence. The comprehension, or the lack of it, belonged to the young man now. Bumpy had done what he could. He always did what he could. The bourbon was finished. He set the glass down on the table, looked at it for a moment, the small amber residue at the bottom, the ring it had left on the wood, the unremarkable evidence of an ordinary evening in a life that was anything but. He thought about legacy, not the word itself. Legacy was a word other people used, journalists and historians, and the kind of men who built monuments to themselves while they were still alive to admire them. Bumpy Johnson did not think in monuments. He thought in outcomes, in the specific, granular, day-by-day question of whether the thing he was building was worth the cost of building it. Legacy, in his understanding, was not what you left behind. It was what you protected while you were here. Then it was the child asleep down the hall with her book on the nightstand. It was the woman reading in the lamplit bedroom who had chosen him, kept choosing him, with full knowledge of what that choice meant. It was the neighborhood outside his window that had fed him and shaped him and demanded everything he had, and that he had given everything to, not because he expected repayment, but because that was the terms of the relationship, and Bumpy Johnson honored the terms of his relationships. But it was the wall, the imperfect, costly, necessary wall, still standing tonight. He stood from the table, straightened his jacket, out of habit, not vanity, always habit. The habit of a man who understood that how you carry yourself when no one is watching is the truest measure of who you are. The street version and the kitchen version, wearing the same coat, the king of Harlem and the father in the doorway, contained in the same body, navigating the same life, paying the same price. He turned off the kitchen light, walked down the hall, paused for one more moment outside his daughter's door, the darkness inside it, the slow breathing, the book on the nightstand, and then continued to the bedroom. Mamie had turned off her lamp. He undressed in the dark, sat on the edge of the bed. Her hand found his in the darkness without searching. The automatic, unhesitating gesture of a woman who knows exactly where her husband is at all times. In every sense of the word, he held her hand. Neither of them spoke. Outside, Harlem moved through its night. The avenue below carried its voices, its laughter, its low, rolling music, its arguments and its reconciliations and its endless human motion. The neighborhood that never fully slept, that had been awake for longer than either of them had been alive, and would be awake long after both of them were gone. Bumpy Johnson listened to it in the dark. His neighborhood, his people, his wall, saw he had kept them safe tonight. Tomorrow he would keep them safe again, and the night after that, and the night after that. For as long as he was the man he was, for as long as the wall held, for as long as Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson drew breath in this city and walked its streets and sat at its tables and looked men in the eye and said the things he meant and meant every single thing he said. That was the legacy. Not a monument, not a name in a history book, not the stories told in back rooms by men who had been in the room and men who wished they had. Just this. A family sleeping safely in a house on a Harlem night. A wall still standing. A man in the dark who knew what it had cost and had decided a long time ago that it was worth it.